Good morning! Jó reggel kívánok! A few words to my local friends. You will see by my last name that I am Hungarian, and my heritage is Hungarian. So I would just like to say a few local words, and then I'll promise you, don't worry, I will go back to English. So, kedves barátaim, kedves Corvinus család, nagyon szépen köszönöm, hogy visszahívtak. Annyira hálás vagyok, hogy visszahívott. Olyan értelmes nekem itt lenni, nem csak egy ilyen fantasztikus pénzügyi konferencián. Gratulálok Péter, Barbara, Edina, Daniel, gratulálok nektek, hogy 10 év, ez fantasztikus. Tovább is. De ez az egyik legszebb város az egész világon. Az egyik óriási nekem visszajönni Magyarországra, ahonnan a családom jön. It's great. So I just simply thank them. It's an important place for me. This is where my heritage is. This is where my mother grew up, my father grew up, my sisters were born and raised. So this is a big deal for me. So I just thank them. And of course, congratulated them for this fantastic conference. So I hope you have a wonderful, enriching 2 days. I will be around. I will be listening to your presentations, and I look forward to learning a lot of things from you. So thank you very much. This morning, I am going to offer you a talk that is unusual. Most keynote speakers stand up and speak about their own research. Today, I will not speak about my research. I'm going to speak about others. I'm going to try to inspire people in this room. I'm going to try and inspire the younger people in this room to take on the challenge of doing research in an area that is absolutely wide open and absolutely critical for our society. We need the truth. Our colleagues in the world are looking for us to give them the truth. It is politically charged, which makes you know it's really important, okay? And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. That's my title, Climate Finance, an Inconvenient Void. Does anybody recognize the title? And it's a play on words from the famous movie and book by Al Gore, the once and almost president of the United States, Al Gore. So, but it's an inconvenient void, which is a negative tone to it. All right. So, climate finance. What is that? Well, here's a definition. This is from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. You will hear this, you should be hearing this more and more. Local, national, transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing that seeks to support the mitigation and adaptation actions that will address climate change. We're talking about the convention itself, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, all calling for financial assistance from around the world with a particular focus from those that are wealthier to help those that are less wealthy to deal with and manage this exposure. It's basically about the fact that we need to probably invest somewhere between $30 and $50 trillion in the next decades to address the impending global warming that people are anticipating. And this infrastructure investment, the financing of which doesn't come from nowhere. And people in our field have a lot of wisdom to bring to bear on this question. And that's really what this is all about. Now, here's a brief, embarrassingly brief summary of the history of how we have addressed climate change in the world. I'm sure that many of you know many of these things, so this is a very quick timeline. Some things start from 1988 and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was created by something called the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environmental Program, those two organizations on the right. They launched the first global summit focused on climate change, the challenges of global warming and climate change in Rio de Janeiro. It was called the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. It was basically establishing the importance of coordinated conversation and discussions about the challenges that lie before. But the real big moment was in 1997 in Kyoto. They were having these annual conventions of the parties, COP. And this was the 1997 COP. It was in this particular agreement that they had announced the importance of investing in infrastructure to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2012, which I remind you now is 7 years ago, and in particularly the collective commitment of individual countries to doing this kind of reduction. For example, 6 billion in CO2 emission equivalent tons by the United States. Now, what you can see is the most interesting part of this convention was the asterisks beside key country names. Do you see those? These were countries that ultimately chose not to ratify this collective commitment. But that did not diminish the importance of the question and the pursuit thereof, and ultimately led to the one we often talk about is the Paris Agreement in 2016. This is a nice little graphic that summarizes the importance of not only the financing, rich countries, each individual rich country requiring to contribute at least 100 billion per year, particularly the focus on the fact that it's the wealthier countries that need to support those that are less wealthy in the world, because this is, as Dr. Nordhaus, the most recent Nobel Prize winner, one before, I should say, who focused on the field of climate economics, recognized this as the world's ultimate public externality. And he recognized the importance of supporting those developing countries in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And the goal was to commit to less than 2 degrees Celsius as a long-term secular growth in global warming. And they talked a lot about the mechanisms. Now, of course, I'm sure you've heard that there are some countries that originally signed on and ratified the agreement and subsequently withdrew from the agreement. And it is not 2 weeks ago that one such country, my country, the United States, announced they have initiated formally the process of de-ratifying or removing themselves from the signing of this. Now, Europe seems to have made big commitments. This is in last November, a year ago, where they had announced, this is one of the commissioners for climate and energy, Mr. Canete, or Arias Canete, who announced that Brussels is expecting to slash all net greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by mid-century. They are estimating that this is going to require an increase of almost 1 full percentage point of GDP as a cost of commitment to infrastructure investment by the EU to reach that goal. The GDP of the EU is something like 18 or 19 trillion dollars, about 14 trillion euros. So you can imagine that this is approximately 300 to 400 billion dollars a year is the extent of the commitment. The dollar magnitudes are massive as we think about the challenges of this problem. Even in the United States, as opposed to focusing on the provisioning of infrastructure to deal with mitigation and adaptation. Here, you see wildfires like what we've been seeing with the Santa Anita winds in Southern California that is creating havoc for the economy. There was a major report in the United States that said that if we do not provision for it, we are at risk of up to 10% reduction, lower GDP in the country. So it's not as much about the positiveness of creating infrastructure to mitigate and adapt as opposed to the losses endured by hurricanes, tornadoes, tropical storms, fires, wildfires that are all linked to it. And this is just a few weeks ago where the Financial Times announced that even with respect to the countries that have signed on to the Paris Agreement, we are falling short of our investments. What do they say here? They said spending on renewable power such as wind, solar, and biomass slipped to 1% in real terms, only to 304 billion across all the countries that are there. So we need to redouble our efforts to push even harder on all of this. Many of our major leaders around the world, this is the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has taken a leadership role in arguing for the fact that the financial services sector has to address this because it's all about the mobilization of capital to fund this infrastructure development. He calls it the tragedy of the horizon, famous speech in 2015. He has mandated that financial services firms and corporations should be more proactive in disclosing climate-related risks that are embedded in their firms. This is Michael Bloomberg, the newly rumored potential president of the United States of the future, and Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, promoting the importance of corporations and financial services firms to commit to greater disclosure. This past September in New York at the United Nations, major banks from around the world have now signed on to the new Principles for Responsible Banking, basically outlining the importance of financial services firms committing themselves with the signatories of the actual chief executive officers of the banks, committing to the provisioning of it. What do we say here? The problem is clear. The needs are great. The parties are mostly committed. And the financial services sector understands their role. Even here in Budapest in Hungary, people are talking about climate change. There's this index that actually can track, even in individual cities, the long-term secular trend in temperature rise. And you can go and find this here. I guess this is Huszár, is it? With those lions? Okay. I don't know where that is. Okay. So apparently a survey this past summer in Hungary says that 85% of Hungarians now believe that climate change is a serious concern. And even, this is from a few weeks ago, this is a minister in the government who says that we are going to be significantly increasing investment in solar energy tenfold. You guys laughed at this picture. I don't know why, but this is a major commitment to solar energy investment by the current administration. We are finance scholars. We have so many questions that relate to this backdrop. Are there any causal links between global temperature rise and firm and industry cash flows? How do we model the valuations for firms and sectors of firms that are vulnerable to climate change? What are the agency, governance, and incentive problems in how corporations are organized that might link to or be distorted by climate risk management? those mandated disclosures about how firms contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, which is linked scientifically to the rise in temperatures and global warming. Are there trade-offs in how they disclose or think about disclosures of these emissions relative to other kinds of corporate risk exposures? What about firms and sectors in which there are stranded assets that are carbon intensive? What are the unique risks? How are those risks valued? Is it possible that for investors, a lot of asset pricing people in this room, can we imagine building a hedge portfolio that somehow replicates the innate risks that are perceived to be there as it relates to climate change? How can we measure a firm's climate risk exposure based on the limited kind of disclosures or environmental ratings that public and private agencies like Morgan Stanley Capital International, a sponsor, provides for? What about weather derivative markets for climate change, uniquely for climate change? We don't have them yet, but you can imagine them. So many questions, so many questions. I'm here to tell you that those questions are open questions. They have not been answered. The world requires us as scholars to be answering these questions. These questions. Now I'm going to bring this personal. So, as Zsuzsa mentioned, I think you mentioned, I was previously an editor of a journal, the Review of Financial Studies. I did that for 7 years. That's a long time. In 2015, in May, I received an email. This is the email here. Dear Professor Karolyi, the title is Finance for the Future, 21st Century Thinking for 21st Century Challenges. It came from two organizations called Accounting for Sustainability and the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. I had never heard of these organizations. It asked me to get on an airplane and go to London on the 25th of May at an undisclosed location. My instinct was, I'm very, very busy. Undisclosed location. Is this real, this email? I showed it to my wife. She said, I don't know if it's real, but you should try to find out. I did, and I decided to go. And here is the sentence in the email that caught my attention. In light of the significant role the Review of Financial Studies, that's the name of my journal at the time, plays in the finance and education space, leading research across the major fields of financial research and being one of the most widely respected and cited academic journals on finance and in economics, we would value your contribution to the discussion. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I got on that airplane. It was at St. James's Palace. It was hosted by His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. The reason it was an undisclosed location is because of security considerations. It was not just me. There were other journal editors from finance in that room. I'm not going to tell you who. During the day, before the Prince of Wales came, we were basically greeted by and hosted by those two organizations. The goals and objectives were very clear. They have been hosting for years major summits of chief executive officers, chief financial officers, chief investment officers of major asset management firms and institutions around the world every year on the issues of climate change. And they had been pushing on them the question, why are you as a corporation not more proactive in your disclosures of climate change related risks? Corporations answer, when we interact with our investors, the investors don't care. That was their answer. I'm giving you the brief version. When then the conversation turned to the chief investment officers of the major financial institutions, they asked them, why is it that you are not pressing the corporations to be more disclose more with respect to the inherent risks of climate-related global warming? They said, the financial science does not support it. There's no research evidence in support of it. What the Prince of Wales and his colleagues did is they then brought the journal editors into the room and put us into a defensive position to say, why are you not publishing research in your financial science journals that relate to these questions? Our answer, we cannot publish papers that do not exist. And they said, we know. So what are you going to do about it? The remainder of the day was their finger pointing in our faces, saying, okay, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? You are the gatekeepers, they said. What are you going to do about it? And that was exactly what the Prince of Wales did in his living room at the end of the day. The need is now. We cannot wait. What are you going to do about it? And of course, we all left sheepishly with our head down, apologizing. Were they right? Ladies and gentlemen, I went to the Web of Science not a few weeks ago, and I did a search. I put the 3 main journals in finance. I could have put more. Review of Finance, Journal of Finance, Journal of Financial Economics. I put into the topic climate change. Peter, what came back? 0. 0. 0. There are no papers published on the topic of climate change in our top finance journals. So I said, okay, maybe that's not a powerful test. Why don't I substitute in the top 5 economics journals and redo? 45. Now the problem is that the top econ journals don't focus on the questions that chief financial officers, chief investment officers those are not necessarily the questions that they really care about. So the pressure was on us. The Prince of Wales's charities understood. Here are the top 5 journals, most highly cited. Not surprisingly, Nordhaus has 3 papers out of the top 5 among those 45 published papers in the top 5 journals in economics. And we now have dedicated things. What are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? So I decided I was going to do something about it. So I created what we now call the RFS, Review of Financial Studies, Climate Finance Initiative. And I'm going to describe to you enormous amounts of work, but I'm going to summarize it in 5 steps. The first thing I needed to do was I needed to convince the society that oversees my journal that I could do something about this topic. The topic is valid, relevant, and I described to them my idea. I'm going to describe to you the idea. I also knew what I didn't know. I am not an expert in climate finance, but I knew that the economists were ahead of us. So I got 2 of my colleagues in economics, Harrison Hong and Jose Schenkman, who I know have been thinking about these issues on the economic side, but they know about our field of finance, that I brought them in as guest editors to work with me. I know what I don't know as much as what I can do here. I needed money to run this. What I was going to do was basically create a competition among scholars in the world, an open call. Can you imagine? An open call for a special issue of the Review of Financial Studies reserved for the topic of climate finance. I know there are no working papers out there, ladies and gentlemen, so what we're going to have is a competition in which you will submit proposals of papers that you would write. And we will judge the validity of this based on the proposals. It's an idea that I stole from psychology and social psychology. It's called a registered report. I had to convince my society that this was a valid editorial protocol. It was brand new. It's only 5 years old. 2013 is the first registered reports in psychology. And we adapted it in finance. I needed money to support me, so I went to the Norges Bank. I've been doing a little bit of work with the Norges Bank. This is the trillion-dollar monster in the world, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Of course, the two societies as well, and the Society for Financial Studies, my bosses. I assembled a blue ribbon scientific committee to help review the prospective proposals that would come. And then finally, I devised this rigorous protocol. These proposals would be evaluated by the scientific committee as well as the editors, and then what we would do is we would require each team of authors of the proposals to come to New York and to present and defend their proposals before a plenary audience. That was in November of 2017. And then, if the proposal is well reviewed, we would give you, are you ready for this? We will give you a golden ticket. You have a guaranteed publication. And yes, I don't even know what the results will be. You have told me what you plan to do, but you will have the ticket, you have a place in the journal at some point in the future. Now go execute your research study. That's what a registered report is. You evaluate the paper before it is written, before the results are known. Of course, this was designed not for climate change, but for the general issue of publication bias that is somewhat a big concern in many, many disciplines, including ours. But I adapted it for this purpose because I thought, A, it would help to relieve the risks and pressures that maybe many scholars out there would feel about entering into a highly risky new discipline like climate finance. And also, the fact that you would accept a paper before the results are known is one in which it may be that the truth would actually come out. If it's true that there is no link, empirical link, between sea level rise, which is associated with global warming, and the melting of the ice, the polar ice caps, if there's no link between sea level rise and property valuations, well then so be it. That's what the science says. That's what the answer should be. People should hear the truth. This, I felt, was a way in which we could ensure that the truth is being reported in the papers that would ultimately be published. And then, of course, we had to have a competition and hope that people showed up. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's the call for papers. We had 106 proposals from all around the world. It was incredibly gratifying. The quality of the proposals were high. It was very, very difficult to choose. If some of you in the room are ones that submitted, I apologize if we didn't accept your proposal. What was also gratifying was the fact that almost 65% of the proposals involved younger scholars, assistant professors, and PhD students, which told me that there was this hunger, this nascent demand, maybe not among the most senior and established scholars, but among the younger scholars to tackle issues that really matter for our society. And they showed up. So we're calling this the first body of knowledge on the topic of climate finance. 9 papers are going to be, there were 9 papers selected for the final issue. I'm going to tell you about some of these papers. It will have on the front of it an editorial by myself, Harrison, and José, and it's coming out in January 2020. The editorial is actually posted as of last week on SSRN, and you're welcome to read it. But it's basically going to be what I just described to you. Now, does anybody have any questions? I'm going to tell you a little bit now about some of the papers. I don't know how much time I have, but I would like to give you a taste for some of the kinds of research that came forward that was incredibly, to me, incredibly fascinating. Are there any, pardon me?
We still have
half an hour, okay. So I'll give you 15 minutes of taste, and then we'll have some questions. So write down your questions. Write down your questions. This is a logical one to start with. Philip Kruger, Zacharias Zautner, and Laura Starks. What they did was they proposed and then ultimately executed the first truly global survey of institutional asset managers around the world on their attitudes about climate finance, or climate, and particularly how it relates to how they manage their portfolios. The response was 439 executives. The survey ran in 2018, and they asked approximately 55 or 56 different questions. Can you imagine? I mean, think about the best way to set the table, right? Would be to run a proper survey. There are the three people. Here are the key facts. I will show you some tables. Number one, among all the risks that investment officers worry about, climate change is not one, not two, not three, not four, but fifth most important. Are you surprised? I was surprised how low it is. 50% state that regulations related to the disclosure, mandated or exhorting people to disclose, is already materializing. That is, they themselves are now starting to put pressure on companies to do more disclosure. Why are they doing this? Well, more often than not, the survey answers are it's about our reputation and ethical considerations. Financial considerations are way down the list. Whether you believe in climate change or care about it or are not sure just how important it is, there's a lot of very balanced data in this report that everybody can take something from it. Less than 7% say that they completely ignore climate change. That means 93% are doing at least something with respect to climate change as they manage their assets. By the way, we're talking cumulatively about $3.5 trillion of assets under management. These are among, as you'll see, among the largest asset managers in the world. Among those that do something, most of them are analyzing or gently engaging with corporations. Very few of them are actually putting forward shareholder proposals or, let alone, letting their money do the talking and divesting, literally divesting. Very few of them are having the guts to do that kind of strong action. Overvaluations related to stranded assets, like carbon-related assets, that is where they perceive them to exist, but they answer in their survey that they are still relatively rare. And furthermore, any possible perceptions of undervaluations, they seem to be correlated with among those investors that are actually disclose themselves to be more ESG, environment, social, or governance related sensitive. So there's not a random set of investors that are engaged in climate related issues. So let me show you some numbers here. There are pension companies represented, insurance companies, mutual funds, major asset owners or asset managers, as well as banks. The blue bars are their sample proportions. The red bar is how these are represented in the world at large using FactSet ownership database. So you can see that, for example, the sample of the surveys were overrepresented among pension funds, highly underrepresented among mutual funds around the world. Interestingly, the typical size of the respondent was larger than that in the population. So you can see the sample is considerably overrepresented relative to the population at large among asset owners or asset managers managing between 20 and 50 billion. And very underrepresented among assets under management less than $1 billion. So it tells you it's important to disclose who it is that is responding, the types of firms. Typically, the bigger players are represented here. According to their perceptions, financial risk is easily, by far and away, the single most important reported risk. 51% of them report that as number one. 15% report operating risk, governance risk, social risk, and then finally, the fifth most important is climate risk. But honestly, the differences between operating and climate risk is not a big margin. But it's basically financial risk and then a bunch of others. These are perceptions about climate change among these asset managers, broken out by where they come from. So you can see the green bar is continental Europe. I don't know if there were any Hungarian institutions that reported to the survey. I don't know that. But people are estimating expectations are global warming of between 2 and 3 degrees. Why is this important? Because it says that the asset owners who are reporting to the survey actually do believe there is temperature rise. That's a starting point in their estimation. Why are you doing this if you're doing anything? This is the percentage with a strongly agree, saying it's about our reputation. 30% say it's about our reputation. 27.5% it's a moral and ethical obligation. Look at here. Well, there's no pointer. Only way down the list is where you start talking about investment returns and actual risks, financial risks. So it's more about a moral question for these asset managers than it is a demonstrable financial considerations, the kinds of things we worry about, part of financial science. What have you actually been doing? They asked the managers. We're analyzing. That's very low touch, very gentle. It's not that we're doing nothing, we're analyzing, is the general answer. Some of them are integrating that into their ESG platforms. Way down the list, do you see anything about formal shareholder proposals? Only 25%. Negative exclusionary screening and divestment is yet another whole area down the list. It's still new. Many asset managers are hesitating to actually engage robustly with corporations with respect to climate change. They're starting, it's still gentle. Very few are doing actual divestment or engaging in shareholder proposals. When you engage with a firm, did the firm respond? They asked, and the answer was 71% of them said that the firm did in fact respond to when they wanted to engage. But when asked how they responded, 35% of them said they acknowledged the issue, but a much smaller fraction said that the firms, when they responded to the engagement, actually were doing something concrete. Finally, they're talking about actual direct engagement. Again, voting against re-election of board directors due to climate-related issues, way down the list. It's still new for these asset managers to be doing anything in this world. How am I doing? One more? I have like 4 or 5 of these studies. I just love talking. I feel like my name is not on any single one of these papers, but they are all my babies. They're all my babies. I am very proud of every one of them. 8 minutes. So we should pause for questions?
No, you have 8 minutes.
Oh, I have 8 minutes, and then we still have questions. So I'll give you 1 or 2 more, okay? So that was the survey. Here are actual papers that you could imagine being presented at today's conference. This one is by Rob Engel, Stefano Giglio, Kelly, Lee, and Strobel. So their question was, they saw those questions that I showed you on the 4th slide, and they said, boy, we think we could try to build a hedge portfolio. You know those questions that I showed you? Those were in the call for proposals. Those were the questions that we, the organizers of this initiative, thought would be the most important ones to ask. I'm not sure that was right, but those were what we asked. These guys proposed to create a portfolio. How do they do it? Well, you know, these climate-related disclosures, they are few, they are spotty. How can you build a hedge portfolio to measure these things, let alone create a long-short portfolio that replicates the performance? So they had the brilliant idea, is what we're going to do is we're going to create a climate change news index. It was going to be about news related to climate change. So what they did was they built a word cloud of words, a glossary of words related to climate change. Okay, and they took this from a number of different sources, what they call authoritative climate changes texts. They then assembled these words and put them into a machine learning textual-based black box and looked at major news sources to see and measure on a daily high-frequency basis the incidence with which these words are used. And they generated this climate change news intensity index. And they showed that the intensity of the news reporting, this is for the Wall Street Journal in particular, and these are dates, they intensify around important dates like the Paris Accords or withdrawal from Kyoto or Trump withdraws from the Paris Agreement. You see a spike in news. So to them, this was a validation of the index. The next step was to build a replicating hedge portfolio, taking long position in some stocks, short positions in others, with a regular rebalancing to try to replicate the up and down movement in the climate change news index. And then what they did was they tried to validate this against the index. That's a scatter plot on the left. And then over here, an ex post measure of the returns. And what they did was they showed that this replicated the index pretty darn well. I don't know if you think an out of sample R-squared performance of 8% is big, but it seems to be reasonable, particularly in extreme movements. And so this is the paper. A new hedge portfolio. I think I have one more thing to show. There are their pictures. Here are what was really fun and a source of great debate at the conferences that we held in New York City and then in London, was actually looking at the individual names of the companies that are in the long side of the portfolio and the short side of the portfolio to get a taste for things. And then I remember a lot of people in the audience, a lot of the asset managers in the audience when we were presenting these results are saying, it doesn't make any sense that motion picture companies would be in the negative category on a climate change index. Remember, this is like these replicating portfolios that we build are mechanical things, and you kind of look at what comes out. So I don't know if this is a good index or not, but it was a valid attempt to try and build a portfolio that I know in the next 10 years compared to the last 10 years, many individual investors as well as institutional investors will want to invest in as they think about risks related to climate change. So they built one, and there it is. 2 more minutes? 1 more minute? I'll give 3 minutes. And then we'll stop. I love this. This is fun. We have in the 9 papers, not 1, but 2 papers on sea level rise. You know, melting polar ice caps, rising water levels all around the world. And what the first major question that you would ask is, how are property valuations for properties, commercial and residential properties, along the coasts related to the projected rise in sea level? So we had not 1, but 2 studies. The first, by Murfin and Spiegel, basically merge tens of millions of individual property valuations along the coasts of Florida, North Carolina, all the way up, with differential projections on sea level rise. They look at many attributes of the houses. This is property valuations. Many attributes of the houses. How high on the land? How close to the ocean? All sorts of things like that. They run the regressions, beautifully specified, no result. Now, when's the last time a paper is published in a top journal with no result? That's what we call publication bias. Now, this is not my opinion. It's not the author's opinion. This was what the science delivered. You can't be angry because that's what the data delivered. Now, the other study looking at sea level, Baldoff Garlapi, Yanelis, another set of 3 exceptional scholars, did the same experiment, but what they did, don't laugh, they went to Yale University, which runs an annual survey of the public's opinion about climate change all around the United States. And what they did was they took all those coastal communities with residential properties, and they looked at which counties have higher incidences of people that believe in climate change, and which counties have people that are more likely to be deniers of climate change. They look at the survey results and mix them with the property valuation and sea level rise results. What do they find? In counties in which there's a higher intensity of people who believe in climate change, negative slope between property valuations and sea level rise. In counties in which there are more deniers, flat. How fun is that? So both studies are right. One is a refinement of the other, you can say. And these are some of the results. This is the example of the underwater homes in Florida. And this is shows you the experimental variation in the differences of opinions. The believers, darker red is counties where there are more believers, and the white or the lighter colored is where the deniers live in Florida, just to give you a taste of this as well. So I will skip all of these. These are the other studies that I wanted to mention, and I'll just go to the last slide. And Zsuzsa, should we just open up for questions? These are studies on mutual funds, studies on extreme temperatures and corporate earnings and sales. Please go read these papers. They are fascinating. They are the first papers written on this new area called climate finance. Questions? Any questions?
So we have 15 minutes for questions. I go over with the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. My name is Huszár from Cyprus.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too, sir. Just curious about that news-based index.
Yeah.
Is it free, available for scholars or researchers?
Why don't you write to the authors?
I will definitely, but I just wanted to know.
I don't know. I have not asked of it. I have not asked for it from them.
The structure looks pretty much like the Economic Policy and Opportunity Index is established.
Yes, like the Baker, Bloom, and Davis, right?
Exactly.
News-based, I'm sure that research, I know that research inspired them.
Okay.
But it's focused on this conglomeration of words related to global warming and climate change. It's a little bit different as opposed to the words of Baker, Bloom, and Davis. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you very much.
You should ask them. And we should encourage them to make it publicly available for others, yeah?
I will definitely. Thank you.
Thank you. Others?
Thank you, Andrew. This is really a worthwhile initiative. Was there any paper in the issue that was really looking at some kind of better estimates of economic costs of climate change? Because there's a wide range, from 5 to maybe 20% of GDP, depending on what you include. So this is, I think, really valuable.
So if you go back to the integrated assessment models of Nordhaus, you will see questions like that being answered. In this study, in this project, we did not want to pursue questions like that because those have already been studied in the econ area. What we wanted to do was to focus on the questions that our chief financial officers and our chief investment officers really wanted the answers to, as I was giving you a sense for it. It's a little bit different kind of audience and community. So I guess the answer is we already felt there were papers looking at that. Now, could there be more integration between those literatures? They feel to me like somewhat segmented literatures, don't they? So the economists that are looking at the public costs, the social costs of climate change for the economy at large, how do those spill over into a world in which we are honing in on the financial sector as an accelerator of growth,
or that's where I see some potential, if you're asking me. So there were no papers like that. These were very much focused on corporate earnings, corporate sales, mutual fund managers, behaviors, the things we normally look at in finance conferences, hedging indices and things like that. But I believe I'm going to take your question as a suggestion that maybe we could merge these literatures a little bit more than we do. Yeah, good. Others?
Up here, Zsuzsa.
Andrew, congratulations for your talk, it's amazing. I'm from Brazil, I'm from Getúlio Vargas Foundation. I have a question basically related to what you said about chief financial officers taking a look at investment opportunity, and there is some papers describing how profitable it is to invest in ESG firms. And the results are not very interesting, so there is no appeal to fund managers to put money on ESG firms. How do you see or if it's possible to change that, or is a matter of time to change to become profitable?
It's a great question. It's a great question.
I'll come at it several ways. First, I guess secretly, my first reaction is, I'm a scientist. I'm part of a scientific community. My first goal is not to try to change attitudes with respect to ESG, environmental risks, or climate change. My first job, especially since we completely ignored this literature forever, is to understand what people are saying and thinking and doing, and observing in their behaviors. So that was step number one. And here are the answers, at least the beginnings of the answers. But I'm not so naive as to believe, in fact, I know it is true, that our colleagues in industry are watching what we do very carefully. It could very well be when they see the results of that survey. It's like holding a mirror up to themselves, and they see that one manager might look at that and say, boy, we are being quite soft with respect to the corporates in terms of demanding actions. The survey says so, and it is pretty clear that investment officer, am also one of those people that are not putting a lot of pressure. I could see how this could change people's behaviors. And I guess my third reaction to your question, what was your first name?
Alan.
Alan. So Alan, my third reaction to your question is, we've been talking about ESG for quite a while now, right? There are many, many funds that are specifically committed to ESG. You are absolutely right about the mixed nature of the results if you looked at it from a meta perspective on ESG and actual investments and valuations. I feel this is a little bit different. It's the E in E, S, and G, maybe a little S, not so much G. Maybe what this is an opportunity. Again, I'm now speaking to the younger scholars in the room who are looking for places in which to focus their energies, is to really hone in on the E and link it to what we're learning here about climate-related risks, to see if we can understand it more. Maybe we're making a mistake when we, as asset managers and scientists, lump ESG together as opposed to separating them out. The answer might be hidden inside, and we need to just look at it the right way. This may be an opportunity to separate and focus on the E. Those are my three of three reactions to this. I hope you can see, everybody, that I don't have all the answers. We clearly don't have all the answers. But what an incredible set of questions that lie before us. Opportunities are massive. And we can render ourselves as financial scholars hugely relevant to the world. I know they're paying attention to us. I know they're paying attention to us. Any more? Yeah.
Thank you for inspirational talk. This is Josh Cohn. I'm Senior Liquidity Manager at HSBC Bank, London.
Okay.
And
so is this resonating with your ears?
Yeah, very much. An experienced PhD student for
very good.
10 years now.
Very good.
So I think climate finance started to get quite a bit of attention. The picture you show, Michael Bloomberg, he's a special...
Yes, he is. Have you read his book on climate?
I haven't. So, and as well, the big financial institutions started to put more commitment, including our institution, which is estimated as $90 trillion capital.
That's right. HSBC is a signatory to the principles of responsible banking.
Yeah, one of the 7
they
institutions.
Are. Yeah.
I think my question is coming. Obviously, it's starting to take attention in UK quite a lot, because maybe some of you know there is a biennial stress test running every 2 years. So this year topic is a liquidity stress, liquidity specifically. But in 2 years, 2021, it's a climate risk. So basically, the order is coming from top of the house. Every single large institution need to look at the climate risk and test what is going to be impact on their balance sheet and future.
Fantastic.
So my question is really coming. I mean, in my day-to-day job, when I design the policies in the bank for liquidity funding, so fundamental problem to get the business's action on it, to design the incentive problem.
Like for the commercial loan officers?
Yeah, commercial.
Yeah.
So how that specific business is have a right incentive to come to the target, strategic target, I put it there, for instance, strategic funding mix. So how do you see this incentive problem for the financial institutions, which is quite targeted? How it can be designed to make it effectively working?
Right. It's an organizational question you're asking. It's extremely important. I see this as a challenge for us. It makes me think of two things. So first of all, thank you for telling us this. I know that this is a major commitment for the major banks around the world now compared to before. And it is, I think, going to be very welcome. The question you're asking, however, is almost organizational. And how do we restrike our incentive program among commercial loan officers to help the bank, the managers, and the bank as a whole develop this sort of enterprise-wide risk management system related to climate change? That's really the mandate of the hour. And I don't have a short answer. To my colleagues out there, I will use this as a platform to say to my colleagues, too often we as finance colleagues look down our noses at our management colleagues. This may be an opportunity where we can actually explore synergy opportunities with our management colleagues to talk about what they know about organizational theory and organizational management and apply it to financial services with this broad overarching topic of enterprise risk management related to climate change. I don't know how to do this. I'm not going to even pretend to know. But I clearly value your affirming the importance of us, finance scholars, redirecting our energies to this topic. I'm sure many, many banks are asking this question right now. You probably know that among your peers around the world. Did everybody hear his question? That's a PhD dissertation right there, in case you're looking for topics. That's probably your topic, right?
Not my topic.
It's not your topic, okay. But it's a good one. It's a good one. Thank you. Thank you.
From Lithuania. With climate change is very closely related transition from fossil-based to bio-based economy. How do you think maybe it could be the new scope branch for research?
How can we do that? Well, for one thing, I think that was, okay, one of the topics we asked in here was about valuations of stranded assets in fossil-based corporations. And none of the proposals really did that well. we finance scholars have a lot of valuable techniques for measuring the intrinsic value associated with assets like that. That's one side of the ledger. None of the papers that are in the volume look at that. I could easily imagine a fascinating study, I'm just off the top of my head, that looks at portfolios that relate to some of these now publicly listed solar energy and wind energy companies that are emerging now and becoming larger and larger. I could easily imagine that being a very interesting research program for a young scholar. I like the nature of your question because you're recognizing that there is a shift. There is probably a shift in the landscape of companies. There is probably an interesting shift that is challenging asset managers, not just the corporations, but also asset managers as they think about these things. I'm sure there's at least one asset management firm has asked whether we could hedge some of the climate change related risks by investing disproportionately in these types of newly emerging technology companies focused on alternative forms of energy. I would encourage that. That's a great question. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tamás.
Tamás.
Yes. Thank you for sharing all this information about the baby. So I have two sets of questions. One question is that we had a debate a few months ago here about the role of finance in the Anthropocene, or the role of finance in the ecological destruction. And there were two extremes. One extreme said that finance has no role in it, and the other said that finance is fueling this ecological destruction. I would be very interested on your take. And so these were the two endpoints of the scale. And the other question is that is regarding New York State attorney sued ExxonMobil because not disclosing full information on the risks of the fossil industry. Yeah. And at approximately the same time, Massachusetts sued ExxonMobil for misleading consumers. What's the word on the street in the States?
Yeah, I'll tell you on that front for sure. So great questions, both of them. First of all, what we all need to know in this room is that this is a politically charged debate. There are people who are incumbents in the financial services industry who clearly believe this is not interesting or not their problem. I hope that this body of knowledge, and especially the survey by Kruger et al. That I've described to you, will take some of those incumbent views and shift them to show them that there are many of their peer colleagues out there in the world who are actually now paying attention. They may not be doing much yet in terms of activist movements with respect to forced divestment or shareholder proposals, initiated shareholder proposals, but they are paying more attention than I think many people realize. So the attitude that this is not our problem and we don't care is clearly getting some science through the surveys is showing us that that's not okay. But I also have a problem, I have some difficulty with the fact that we are mandating this from a moral perspective. I don't have a problem with moral principles. We should all have moral principles. This is a challenge of our time, but I personally prefer, as a financial scientist, I prefer very much a data-driven, objective assessment of the realities that we face, as opposed to a perceived reality that may not be what the data shows. So for me, I take as much joy from a really good research paper that renders a non-result. If that's what the data says, that's what the data says. I take as much joy and draw as much from that as I would from a positive or let alone a negative result. It's because it's advancement of science. So the idea that the other side has this, you know, how could you possibly not be paying attention is also equally problematic. Now, whether I've never heard anybody say that the financial services sector is fueling climate change. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. But you know, I'm sure people are allowed to have any opinions. The view from the U.S. is, and around the world, is I am seeing much more, and people are reaching out to me, much more bubbling up of activism with respect to this. So there are going to be, in short order, not just students on campuses protesting that their universities' endowments divest from fossil fuel companies like ExxonMobil, or challenge them for the fact that they haven't fully disclosed about the full extent of their stranded assets or leakage from their you know, their leaching from their solar panels into the soil. It's that there is a movement going on. There's going to be much more formalized organizational institutions that are going to be coming to the fore, that are going to be challenging many asset managers more aggressively than we have seen before. Many of them will be maybe union retirement funds, union-led retirement funds. You'll see a lot more progressive organizations that are turning into activists that are pressuring. I think we are starting to see only the beginnings of those kind of challenges. In the next 10 years, I predict there'll be a lot more. And you can see they're starting, but it's still early. It's still early. We should stop? One more? One more. A final thought to share? Peter, up here. He's going to take the last one.
Yeah, I like theory, and I'm curious if there is any new theoretical insights in one of the papers.
I am so grateful for your question. Please read in this volume the forthcoming paper by Lars Hansen, Buzz Brock, and Mike Barnett. Barnett, Brock, and Hansen. Hansen, of course, is the Nobel laureate. What he has done is developed a new theoretical model of asset pricing that takes into account some of his most favorite attributes in his existing modeling efforts, which relate to model uncertainty, okay, and ambiguity aversion. But in this one, what he does is calibrates a model around a long-run risk about which there is uncertainty. He overlays that into his existing types of modeling frameworks. It's a purely theoretical paper, and it is. I don't know which one of these 9 papers that we're publishing is going to have the highest citations count 5 years from now, but I suspect that I know he's been giving a lot of speeches and talks about this one. Please read that one. Barnett, Brock, Hansen. It's in the special volume. The first theoretical model of asset pricing focused on a model uncertainty, or an uncertainty with respect to climate risk. So, fantastic. Thank you.
So, with the final note, I actually read the call for the paper, so I actually have a climate paper in working on Australia. So,
super.
I just want to defend a little bit Australia with the positive numbers. Actually, the government pension fund is restricting the mining industry's output. And this goes back a little bit to your point, because it's a double-edged sword. Because if they're restricting the mining output, the pension fund returns are affected. So you know, it's a very complex question, and I encourage everybody to work on it. Yeah. So hopefully you learned a lot, you got motivated, everybody goes back to the study room and work and drive students actually to work even more on the topic. I had a student who was really excited to work on this. So thank you again. I would like to ask everybody to thank Andrew.
Thank you.